Was Sigmund Freud a cocaine addict? During his party attendances, he would dress in his finest clothes and snort grams of cocaine to loosen his tongue, as he mentioned in a letter to his fiancée in 1886. Freud referred to cocaine as a magical drug and prescribed it to his patients for a range of ailments, including morphine addiction, ironically. For Freud, cocaine was seen as an analgesic with the potential to alleviate deep pain, and he was particularly interested in its internal properties and utility beyond its external application. He considered this wonderful substance as an effective panacea for treating digestive disorders, fatigue, depression, and morphine addiction. However, over time, Freud discovered that cocaine was not as miraculous as he initially thought, and that it could be both remedy and poison. His perception of cocaine evolved from being a hope for professional recognition to being a subject of questioning about his fledgling career. This 12-year period in which the psychoanalyst consumed cocaine was thoroughly explored in the book Anatomy of Addiction, written by Howard Markel, a professor at the University of Michigan. The essay recounts Sigmund Freud's relationship with cocaine, revealing how his consumption gradually increased, convinced that this substance was an elixir of life. In the early 1860s, the German pharmaceutical company Merck began producing very limited quantities of cocaine, totaling around 50 grams per year until the late 1870s. Meanwhile, in the United States, the pharmaceutical company Parke-Davis also ventured into the production of this drug. It would only be another decade before the medical uses of the drug began to be discovered. Merck promoted it as a remedy for morphine addiction, affecting many ex-soldiers. Cocaine, as we know it now, was isolated for the first time in 1859 by the German chemist Albert Niemann. However, it wasn't until the 1880s that it began to gain popularity among the medical community. At that time, a young Sigmund Freud had just graduated as a doctor. Although he had not yet begun to use hypnosis to treat neurosis or hysteria, Freud, curiously, was enthusiastic about cocaine at that time. The neurologist was intrigued by the possibilities that the drug could offer and decided to experiment both on himself and his friends. On one occasion, he wrote to his fiancée, "I regularly take very small doses against depression and indigestion with the most brilliant success." Between 1884 and 1887, Freud wrote numerous articles about the analgesic and stimulant properties of cocaine, with the most prominent being Über Coca from 1887, a 70-page report. In the first part, he explored the origins of the plant and its history of use in South America, before focusing on the differential effects of the drug on animals and humans. Just 2 years later, in 1886, John Pemberton incorporated coca leaves as an ingredient in his new and subsequently famous beverage, Coca-Cola. The energizing effects of the drink greatly increased its popularity, as well as that of the drug itself. In 1883, Merck produced only 0.4 of a kilogram of cocaine. But by 1885, its production had skyrocketed to 83 kilograms. In January 1885, Sigmund Freud began researching the effects of cocaine. In his first study, he measured how cocaine affected muscle strength and reaction times. He concluded that the physical benefits and improvement in reaction times were linked to the sense of well-being that cocaine induced. In another study in August 1885, Freud focused on the internal effects of cocaine, such as reducing fatigue and depressive symptoms. He even suggested using it in psychiatry to treat morphine withdrawal and alcoholism. 2 years later, in 1887, Freud adopted a more cautious stance. Although he still advocated for certain uses of cocaine, such as its potential in morphine addiction, he withdrew his recommendation for subcutaneous injections. Despite the possible negative effects, Freud argued that cocaine should not be dismissed for achieving certain therapeutic goals, as results varied from individual to individual. In 1895, Freud was still abusing cocaine, and under its influence, he and a colleague performed surgery on a woman named Emma Eckstein. The surgical intervention resulted in an error that, in part, was due to Freud's drug abuse. Although Eckstein survived, the fatal mistake haunted the doctor for a long time and eventually led him to abandon cocaine use. By then, however, the widespread use of the drug was already prevalent in many places. Although it would be many years before science fully understood the catastrophic consequences of cocaine abuse, Freud stopped using it in 1896 at the age of 40. He began experiencing palpitations and noticed a considerable decline in his intellectual performance. The alkaloid present in cocaine was responsible for the premature death of his friend and may have contributed to the deaths of several of his patients. For a time, Freud was such a habitual user that his nose often appeared red and wet. To overcome this harmful habit, he tried to keep himself busy for most of the day. He would wake up at 6 in the morning, see 12 patients, and spend the rest of his time reading and writing until well into the night. Meanwhile, in 1905, the world embraced cocaine inhalation with open arms. Advertisements promoting the apparent benefits of cocaine became common. Cocaine drops for toothache, instant cure, and coca wine for mental or physical fatigue were just some examples. Some claimed that, unlike morphine, cocaine did not create addiction. To no one's surprise, just 5 years later, hospitals and medical literature began reporting nasal damage caused by its use. For example, in 1912, the United States government reported up to 5,000 deaths related to cocaine in just 1 year. Freud will be remembered as a prominent cocaine user of the 19th century. In his work, one can distinguish an early period in which the drug induces a state of controlled euphoria, followed by another period in which the formation of a compulsive need is evident. This pre-psychoanalytic period was described by Freud himself as an alotrión, a momentary deviation from the path that would lead him to the great works that marked his later years and gave rise to psychoanalysis. The word alotrión is as interesting as it is enlightening to understand the cocaine episode, as Ernest Jones called it in his 1963 work. This word can be defined as a rupture or as the introduction of an alien idea into the body of ideas within a certain scientific discourse or doctrine. In this context, it is suggested that Freud may have repressed something related to this episode in his life, which could manifest itself through a slip like the choice of the word alotrión. The controversy over the influence of cocaine use on Freud's work may never be fully resolved, but most researchers agree that his brightest period came after he stopped using it. In his final years, Freud acknowledged, perhaps as a way to exonerate his past, that my research on cocaine was a distraction that kept me anxious to conclude. In his pre-psychoanalytic stage, he sought to cure his patients through the use of medications. His later evolution was to cure his patients through psychoanalysis without requiring pharmaceutical objects. Ultimately, the Austrian studies on cocaine posed something that is still very relevant today: the search for chemistry to alleviate psychological problems. Leave your opinion in the comments about Freud and his relationship with cocaine, and if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends.